How's it going, guys? I'm Mike Dwyer from the Bunker Recordings and BetterMixes.com, and today I want to talk about gain staging. This seems to be a really hot topic right now, and there's a lot of information floating around about it, so I just want to make this video to dispel a couple of myths real quick, show you what you really need to know, and just simplify it for you. Quick note, everything I'm talking about here is in regards to in-the-box mixing. If you have an analog or a hybrid setup, it gets a little bit more complicated, but if you're strictly in the box, then all of this will apply. Also, if you have a gain staging method that works for you and you're happy with, then that's totally fine. I'm not saying you have to change, but I see a lot of people asking about this, so I just want to simplify it a little bit. So the first myth I want to talk about here is the myth that you need to record everything as hot as possible. When I went to school for audio, they taught us that you want to record basically as hot as possible without clipping, aiming for your meters to be like way up here just below zero, and that's just wrong. This is kind of a leftover thing from analog days. When you were recording to tape, the tape machine itself has an inherent amount of hiss and noise in it. So people would try to record pretty hot to minimize that noise compared to the level of the actual audio they were recording. Nowadays, that's not really an issue. The noise floor in modern converters is so low that there's really no need to worry about this. And of course, the downside to recording so hot is you risk clipping if the source gets just a little bit louder. So if you're recording, just leave yourself plenty of headroom. I'll usually kind of aim for somewhere around maybe -8, but as long as you're not clipping, it really doesn't matter. You don't have to be super specific about exactly where you're hitting on the meters. I actually worked on an old vintage Neve console for quite a few years, and it only had 5 decibel steps on the mic preamps. So that actually ended up being really good for teaching me not to worry about the numbers so much because I literally couldn't be that precise. If I wanted to turn it up, I had to turn it up 5 decibels. So again, it really doesn't matter too much. Just as long as you're not clipping, you're fine. So the next myth that I want to talk about is I've seen a lot of people say that you should normalize all your tracks so everything is peaking at -16. Now the theory behind this is that with most converters, -16 in Pro Tools here is equal to 0 dB VU, which was a pretty normal level to record at on a console in the analog world, and therefore any analog modeled plugins you might be using will work better at this level. But the problem with this is these meters are very different from analog VU meters. If you run a sine wave at -16 here, it should read 0 on a VU meter, but most of us aren't recording sine waves. Things that are transient heavy, like drums, act very differently on these meters than they do on a VU. So just to show this, let's solo up this snare track, turn all our processing off, and just bring this up. This is just a trim module and a VU meter, so we can see what's going on. So I'm just going to use this trim so that our snare is peaking around -16 here, and then we can see what it's doing on the VU meter. All right, so we're right around 16 there, and let's check our VU meter. Barely even registering. So a more accurate way to do this would be to put a VU meter on every channel and use a trim to drive it up to 0. And I've seen a lot of people do this, but I think this is kind of silly too. Because again, on something transient heavy like this snare drum, let's see what happens when we get our meter reading 0 here. So we're hitting 0 on our VU meter. I had to boost that 21 decibels. And look what our Pro Tools reading is here. So we're absolutely pegging our meter here. We're 12 decibels above 0, which gives us a couple problems. One, let's throw on an analog modeled compressor, which is what people say we want to do this technique for anyway. And now let's see what we get. So with our gain staging like this, I literally can't not compress this less than like 3 dB with this compressor. I've got the input as low as it goes, and it's still compressing. Alternatively, if we set this back to 0, have a nice normal looking level. I can go anywhere from no compression up to a boatload of compression. So I think that ought to bust the myth that having all your tracks hit at 0 VU makes analog modeled plugins work better. And the other problem with having this way up here is depending on what plugins you're using, going above 0 in between different plugins can sometimes lead to some really nasty distortion. Again, that depends on what plugins you're using. Some handle it better than others, but if you just record at a normal level, you're fine. Then the next myth I want to talk about is that if you hit into the red on your master fader, that you need to go back into your mix and drag every single fader down. And yeah, you could just use the all group and bring everything down together, but that can still cause some problems in your mix because anything that's being sent to a parallel bus or an effects bus or something, the levels might get a little bit weird there. If your mix is super straightforward and you don't have anything bussing anywhere, then there's nothing wrong with that method, but there's also an easier way to deal with it. I'm pretty sure basically every modern DAW works like this. It's super easy to test to find out if yours does. Pro Tools does, unless you're working on like Pro Tools 8 or something. But internally, inside the software, it operates way, way, way above 0. So even if you see things hitting 0, as long as the output of your master fader isn't going above 0, you're totally fine. So to demonstrate that, I have my drums sending to 2 identical buses here. The only difference is the level. I have this one cranked up super, super loud so that it will undoubtedly be going above 0. And then this one's at a more reasonable level. And then they're going to 2 identical buses here. So first, let's take a look at our low level one. That sounds good, obviously. Now we'll unmute this one. I'm going to leave this muted because it's going to be really stupid loud. But you can see here, we are going almost 9 decibels over 0. But in this case, again, instead of going back and bringing all these faders down and then probably having to tweak our reverbs, and if we had any like compression or something going on the drum bus, tweaking that, we can just put a trim plug in here. And I'm bringing this down 17 decibels, just because that's the difference between our two here, since this is at plus 12 and this is minus 5. So we're going to turn that on, and let's listen to that. And it doesn't sound distorted. And just to prove that it's not messed up, I have the phase flipped on this, and I'm going to put both of these in at the same time. And by flipping the phase, if there's any distortion or anything else funny going on because of us going over 0, we'll be able to hear that. But as you can see, we're not hearing anything, which means that these are identical. So again, if you see your mix bus or your master bus getting a little bit hot, just throw a trim plugin on and you're good to go. So the final gain staging myth I want to talk about is the one that if you're sending your track out to be mastered, your master bus should be hitting right at -6. And people say that this is to leave headroom for the mastering engineer. But that really doesn't make any sense. As long as it's not above 0, your mastering engineer can just turn the track up or down to get it to whatever level they want. So now that we've talked about a lot of the myths around gain staging, let's just talk about what you should know. The 2 most important things around gain staging is don't clip on the way in and don't clip on the way out. That's really it. When you're recording, don't hit 0. And when you're bouncing or exporting your final mix, don't go above 0. A couple more helpful tips is in most cases, like I mentioned earlier, you don't want to clip in between plugins. So if you're bringing up an EQ and you're just doing a ton of boosting, something like this, whatever, it's usually a good idea just to bring the output of the plugin down. And this is for 2 reasons. One, again, just to avoid clipping in between plugins because some of them don't handle that so well. And level matching your input to your output makes it easier to compare the process signal to the bypass signal to make sure that you're actually improving the sound and aren't just being tricked by the fact that it's louder. And finally, if you run into a case where maybe your signal is super, super low and you have to have the input on your compressor like totally cranked to get any kind of gain reduction out of it or whatever, all you have to do is go here and, this overhead track looks pretty low. So if this is the one we were having trouble with, just grab the clip gain fader here and just bring that up. And now we've got a nice healthy level. And same thing goes if you've got something that's too hot, like maybe these rooms were a little too hot and it was compressing too much even with the threshold all the way down or whatever. All you have to do is that. It's that simple. So I hope this cleared up some things for you. If it did, be sure to leave a thumbs up and subscribe. And head on over to bettermixes.com to grab a free copy of my Ultimate EQ cheat sheet.